The sun hung low over Delphi, casting a golden light across the sprawling landscape that surrounded the ancient temple of Apollo. It was a place revered by mortals and gods alike, a sacred site where the oracle's visions had shaped the fate of nations for centuries. The marble columns of the temple towered over the valley, their surfaces etched with offerings from kings, warriors, and leaders who had come seeking the wisdom of the divine. Inside, the scent of burning incense wafted through the air, mingling with the whispers of priests and the sound of footsteps echoing through the grand hall. At the heart of it all sat the Oracle of Delphi, her figure draped in white robes, seated upon the sacred tripod. The fumes of the laurel leaves, burning in the sacred hearth, curled around her as she prepared for another prophecy. Her eyes were closed, her mind drifting between the realms of the mortal and divine, waiting for Apollo's voice to speak through her. But today, there was an unease that sat heavy in her chest, a quiet dissonance that she couldn't place. The doors of the temple swung open with a loud creak, and the oracle's serene face tensed slightly at the sound. The priests hurried to receive the visitor, but she already knew who it was. King Theseus of Athens, a frequent visitor of the oracle, had come once again. His presence always brought a storm with it, and today she could sense the tempest brewing. Theseus strode confidently into the hall, his regal bearing unmistakable even in the dim light. His armor gleamed, the polished bronze reflecting the flickering flames of the torches. Despite his kingly status, there was an air of uncertainty about him, a subtle tension in the set of his jaw and the quickness of his pace. "Oracle," Theseus called out, his voice reverberating off the temple's high walls. He approached her with a determined step, his brow furrowed in concern. "I have come seeking your guidance once more." The oracle did not open her eyes. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of centuries. "Speak, King of Athens. What troubles you?" Theseus hesitated, something rare for a man of his stature. "Athens faces a new threat. There are murmurs of dissent within my city, whispers of rebellion, but I know not who leads this shadowy force. My enemies grow bolder, and I fear they have aligned themselves with darker powers. I seek your counsel, your vision of what is to come." The oracle remained still, her breath deepening as she prepared to connect with the divine. Apollo's guidance had never failed her, and she knew the god would reveal the truth to her. As he had always done, she inhaled deeply, feeling the familiar warmth of the laurel smoke fill her lungs, waiting for Apollo's presence to guide her mind. But today, something was different. As the smoke coiled around her, she was not met with the usual calm. Instead, a sudden sharp pain pierced her mind, like a bolt of lightning cutting through the haze. Her body stiffened, her hand clenching the arm of the tripod. She could hear Theseus's voice calling her name in concern, but it was distant, muffled by the roaring sound that now filled her ears. She was being pulled somewhere dark and unknown. And then the vision struck her. It was not the comforting, clear voice of Apollo that guided her. It was something else, something ancient, older than even the gods of Olympus. Her eyes flew open, but she did not see the temple around her. She saw flames. She saw temples, magnificent and towering, crumbling to the ground. The sound of stone collapsing filled the air, mingled with the cries of people, gods and mortals alike. Statues of Zeus, Athena, and Apollo were toppled, their broken pieces lying in the dust. She saw the Acropolis of Athens wreathed in smoke and ruin, the Parthenon burning as rebels, their faces shrouded in shadow, stormed through the streets. At their head was a figure cloaked in darkness, holding a banner that bore no symbols of the gods. And above it all, the heavens themselves trembled. The sky cracked open, and she saw the gods, the mighty Olympians, falling, their forms shrinking, their once bright and all, powerful auras fading into nothingness. Zeus, wielding his thunderbolt, was powerless to stop it. Apollo, her own patron, called out in vain as the light of his chariot dimmed, swallowed by the void. The vision shifted again, and she saw the earth split open, a black chasm yawning wide. From the depths of that darkness, something rose, a force older than the gods themselves, vast and unknowable, whispering promises of a new order. A force that cared nothing for Olympus, nothing for mortals, only for the destruction of what was. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vision was gone. The oracle gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She gripped the edges of the tripod, her body trembling as she fought to regain control. Her mind reeled from the sheer force of what she had just seen. This was not Apollo's doing. The gods had not sent this vision. No, this was something far darker, something outside the reach of the Olympians. Oracle Theseus's voice was close now. Filled with concern, he had stepped forward, his hand reaching out but not daring to touch her. She blinked, her vision slowly returning to the present, the temple coming back into focus. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned her gaze to the king. "Theseus," she whispered, her voice weak but urgent. I have seen the fall of Athens, but not just Athens, all of Olympus." Theseus's eyes narrowed, confusion and disbelief flickering across his face. "What are you saying? The fall of Olympus, the gods. The gods will fall." The oracle interrupted, her voice growing stronger as the weight of the prophecy settled within her. Their power wanes, a rebellion rises, not just in Athens but across the world. Mortals are turning against the gods, and the gods are powerless to stop it. A force older than the gods themselves is coming. It will tear down the temples and cast the Olympians into darkness. Theseus stared at her, his expression frozen in disbelief. This cannot be. The gods are eternal. Their power is not what it once was, the oracle said, her eyes flashing with an urgency she had never felt before. Something has changed. This vision was not from Apollo. It came from somewhere else, something far more ancient. If we do not act, Theseus, everything we know will crumble. The king took a step back, his hand falling to the hilt of his sword, as if the blade could somehow protect him from the weight of her words. "This is madness," he muttered, shaking his head. "The gods will not fall. They cannot." "You can dismiss it if you choose, Theseus," the oracle said, her voice firm, but this vision was clear. "The rebellion has already begun. The gods are losing their hold on this world, and if you do not prepare, Athens will burn." For a moment, Theseus stood there silent, his mind racing. Then, slowly, he shook his head again, this time more decisively. "No," he said, "I do not believe it. The gods have protected us for centuries. They will not abandon us now." The oracle watched as he turned and strode from the temple, his footsteps echoing through the hall. She felt a cold knot of dread settle in her stomach as the great doors closed behind him with a resounding thud. She sat there for a long time, her heart heavy with the weight of the vision. Theseus had dismissed it as madness, but she could not. She had seen the fall of the gods, felt it in her bones, and she knew deep down that the prophecy was not something she could ignore. Whatever force had sent that vision, it was coming. The end was near, and the gods themselves could do nothing to stop it. The temple of Apollo felt colder after Theseus left, the grand stone walls no longer emanating the familiar warmth of divine presence. The oracle remained seated on her sacred tripod, her fingers clenched tightly around the armrests. The vision still burned in her mind, vivid, terrifying, and far too real. A prophecy not from Apollo, but from something ancient, older than Olympus, older than the gods themselves. She knew Theseus was wrong to dismiss it. His arrogance would be his downfall, but there was something else gnawing at her, a quiet terror that crept into her thoughts as she recalled the faces of the gods falling from the sky. Could it be true? Were they really losing their power? A faint sound stirred behind her, the shuffling of sandals on the smooth stone floor. She turned her head just as the high priest of Apollo approached her, his face etched with concern. He was an old man, his robes heavy with the dust of the temple's long history, but his eyes gleamed with the sharpness of one who had served the gods for decades. "Oracle," he said softly, his voice grave, "the vision." The oracle exhaled slowly, the words heavy on her tongue. "Something dark." It was not from Apollo. The priest's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "Not from Apollo, but you sit at his sacred tripod. You are his voice." She shook her head, rising from her seat with shaky legs. "I was not his voice today. There is something else. Something far older than the gods. It sent me a warning, a prophecy of the end, of the fall of Olympus." The priest's face paled, and he instinctively made the sign of Apollo across his chest, as if trying to ward off some unseen evil. "You speak of blasphemy, oracle. The gods cannot fall. They are eternal." The oracle's gaze hardened. "That is what Theseus said. and that is why he left, unwilling to listen. But I have seen it. The gods will fall. Their temples will crumble. The rebellion of mortals is coming, and the gods will be powerless to stop it. For a moment, the priest said nothing, his eyes darting to the temple's towering statue of Apollo, as if searching for a sign from the god himself. The stillness of the room, the eerie silence of the temple, seemed to mock the idea of divine power. "What will you do?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I must go to them." The oracle said, determination settling in her bones. The gods must hear this prophecy, whether they wish to or not. The summit of Mount Olympus was draped in an ethereal mist, the great palace of the gods looming above the world below. Its golden spires pierced the sky, and the halls were filled with the radiant light of divine power. Yet, despite its grandeur, a strange tension gripped the mountain. The gods, though they sat in their magnificent thrones, could feel something unsettling, a distant tremor in the fabric of the universe, a disturbance that they could not yet explain. In the heart of the palace, Zeus sat upon his great throne, his eyes scanning the room as the other Olympians gathered. His brow was furrowed, and the lightning bolt in his hand crackled faintly as though reflecting the unease in his thoughts. To his right, Athena sat with her chin resting on her hand, her sharp eyes observing everything with quiet intensity. To his left, Apollo stood, a frown tugging at the corners of his mouth as he stared toward the entrance of the hall, as if expecting someone. The gods had felt it, an odd, distant pulse, like a heartbeat of the earth itself. Zeus had called them together, sensing that something was brewing beyond even his omnipotent sight. "Father," Athena finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tense silence. There is unrest among the mortals, whispers of rebellion, of doubt in our divine authority. We must act before it spreads. Zeus's expression darkened, but he did not respond immediately. He leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his throne. He had ruled the heavens and the earth for millennia, and in all that time, mortals had always whispered. But this felt different. He could feel it, a strange, gnawing presence at the edges of his consciousness. "I have felt it too," Apollo said, stepping forward, his golden robes shimmering. "The visions I grant to my oracles, they have been unclear. There is something blocking my sight. It is unlike anything I have experienced." Before anyone could respond, the great doors of the palace swung open with a resounding crash. The gods turned, and there stood the oracle of Delphi, her eyes wide, her breathing heavy from the journey. The priests who had accompanied her hesitated at the threshold, trembling in the presence of the gods, but the oracle stepped forward without fear. Apollo's eyes widened in recognition. "You. What brings you here, Oracle?" The oracle lowered her head, respectfully, but did not falter. "I bring a warning, my lords, a vision, a prophecy that I could not ignore." Zeus's eyes narrowed, the air around him crackling with faint arcs of lightning. "Speak." The oracle lifted her gaze, meeting the king of the gods with unwavering resolve. I saw the end of Olympus. I saw the temples falling, the gods fading from the heavens. A rebellion rises not just in Athens, but across the world. Mortals are turning against you, and your power is slipping away. Gasps rippled through the assembled gods. Athena's brow furrowed, her grip on her spear tightening. Apollo took a step forward, his face hardening. "That cannot be," he said, his voice edged with disbelief. "I have foreseen no such thing. I am the god of prophecy." "This vision was not yours." "Apollo," the oracle replied, "it came from something far older than you, older than all of Olympus." At this, a shiver seemed to pass through the room. The gods exchanged uneasy glances. Even Zeus, for all his arrogance, felt a cold knot of fear settle in his chest. Something older than Olympus. "Blasphemy!" Hera hissed from her seat, her eyes flashing with anger. "There is nothing older than the gods. We are eternal." "Eternal?" The oracle's voice echoed through the hall, her words carrying the weight of her vision. "I saw your temples fall. I saw mortals rise against you. They no longer fear your wrath. They no longer seek your favor. Something ancient, something unknown has tampered with fate itself. If you do not act, you will be consumed by it." Zeus rose from his throne, towering over the oracle, his face dark with thunderous rage. "Enough!" His voice shook the palace, sending tremors through the air. "No mortals shall speak of the gods' demise. We are the rulers of the heavens, and no force, mortal or otherwise, will threaten us." The oracle held her ground, her gaze steady. "You can deny it all you wish, but the vision was clear. The rebellion has already begun, and your power wanes with every moment you hesitate." Athena stepped forward, her voice calm but edged with concern. "Father, wait. There is wisdom in hearing the oracle. Mortals are fickle, and their loyalty to us has always been tenuous. Perhaps we should investigate." Zeus turned to his daughter, his eyes burning with frustration. "Investigate what, Athena? Ghosts and shadows? The ramblings of a mortal?" Apollo, too, spoke up, his face unreadable. "She is my oracle, father, and though I do not know where this vision came from, I do not believe she is lying." For a moment, Zeus said nothing, his stormy gaze flickering between his daughter, his son, and the oracle. The silence stretched on, thick with tension. Then, with a deep, weary sigh, Zeus relented. "Very well. If there is indeed something ancient at work here, then we will find it." "Hermes," he called, his voice firm, "you will go to the mortal realm. Speak to those who whisper of rebellion. Find the source of this unrest." Hermes, who had been lounging casually against one of the marble columns, straightened at the command. His face, normally playful and carefree, grew serious. "As you wish, father." The oracle lowered her head, knowing she had done all she could, but as she turned to leave, she felt the cold gaze of Zeus lingering on her. "The gods, despite their arrogance, were afraid. She could see it in their eyes. As the great doors of Zeus's palace closed behind her, the oracle descended the steps of Mount Olympus, her mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts. The weight of the prophecy still pressed heavily on her, and though she had spoken her truth to the gods, she feared it would not be enough. Their arrogance, their belief in their own invincibility, it could be their undoing. But there was no time to dwell on it now. She had seen the rebellion brewing in the mortal world, and she knew it would not wait for the gods to act. Down in the realm of mortals, the whispers of rebellion were already spreading like wildfire. Athens, once a beacon of devotion to the gods, was now filled with unrest. There were those who questioned the gods' right to rule, who wondered if the Olympians were as powerful as they claimed. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were growing rapidly. As she reached the foot of Mount Olympus, the oracle found herself once more in the world of men, where the sky seemed darker and the air carried a charge of something unspeakable. Change, revolution. She could feel it in the wind. The streets of Athens, normally bustling with merchants, scholars, and citizens, were tense. Soldiers patrolled more frequently, and rumors circulated in hushed voices. The grand temples to Athena, Zeus and Apollo, stood as silent witnesses to the unrest, their towering columns casting long shadows over a city teetering on the edge of rebellion. In a darkened alley, a group of cloaked figures gathered, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. At the center of them stood Argos, a charismatic leader whose words had begun to ignite the fires of rebellion across the city. He was tall, his shoulders broad and his eyes sharp with ambition. Unlike many of his followers, he did not fear the gods. In fact, he despised them. These gods, Argos muttered, his voice low but full of contempt. They sit in their ivory palaces, dictating our fates as if we are nothing more than pawns on their divine chessboard. I, for one, am done with them. The others nodded in agreement, their faces tight with the weight of their own anger. One of them, a woman named Hemelina, spoke up, her voice trembling with frustration. But how can we fight them? Argos, the gods have ruled for centuries. They have powers beyond anything we could ever possess. Argos's lips curled into a smile. Powers, yes, but they are not invincible. Look around you, Melina. The gods grow weak. Their temples no longer hold the same reverence they once did. Mortals question them now, and soon they will realize that the gods are no more powerful than the winds or the sea. They are simply old beings, clinging to their thrones. But we need more than words to bring them down, another man said, stepping forward. We need an army. Argos' smile widened. And we will have one. The people are ready. They are angry. All they need is a spark. Once that spark ignites, it will spread across Greece like wildfire. We will bring the gods to their knees. As he spoke, the oracle watched from the shadows, hidden beneath the cover of night. She had followed Argos and his followers into this dark alley, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. She had seen the vision, seen Argos leading the charge against the gods, and yet, standing there in the shadows, she still could not believe how quickly the tides were turning. Argos turned to the group, his eyes gleaming with purpose. Tomorrow we march on the temple of Zeus. We will tear it down stone by stone. And when the people see that even Zeus himself cannot protect his temple, they will rise up with us. This is just the beginning. The oracle's breath caught in her throat. This was the spark. Argos was going to ignite the rebellion, and there would be no turning back. High above, on Mount Olympus, Hermes prepared for his descent into the mortal realm. The messenger of the gods, with his winged sandals and swift movements, had always enjoyed a sense of freedom. He moved between realms with ease, delivering messages, stirring mischief, and, at times, resolving conflicts. But now, as he prepared to enter Athens, there was a tension that even he could not shake. He had seen the uncertainty in Zeus's eyes, the fear in the faces of the other gods. For the first time in centuries, the Olympians were beginning to doubt their own power, and Hermes, ever the observer, had noticed something else. An ancient force lurking at the edges of fate, something that even he, with all his divine speed, could not outrun. He arrived in Athens just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky a deep shade of red. It seemed fitting, almost ominous, as if the city itself was preparing for bloodshed. Hermes moved swiftly through the streets, unnoticed by the mortals who passed him. He could hear the whispers of rebellion in every corner, the fear and anger in the voices of the people. He made his way to the grand temple of Athena, where the priests still held their nightly rituals, but fewer and fewer citizens came to pay their respects. The decline in offerings was a stark contrast to the devotion that had once filled this sacred space. As he entered the temple, Hermes sought out Cleon, the high priest of Athena, who had been a loyal servant to the goddess for decades. Cleon was a man of wisdom, but even he seemed troubled as he lit the sacred fire that burned in the center of the temple. "Cleon," Hermes called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. The priest turned, his eyes widening as he recognized the god. He quickly knelt, bowing his head. "My lord Hermes, what brings you to our temple?" Hermes motioned for him to rise. "I have come for answers, Cleon. There are whispers of rebellion, of mortals turning against the gods. I need to know what you have heard." Cleon's face grew somber. "It is true, my lord. There is unrest in the city. A man named Argos has been gathering followers, speaking of casting down the gods and rising above them. He is bold, fearless, and dangerous." Hermes frowned, his mind racing. He had heard of men like Argos before, men who challenged the gods, who sought to defy fate. But there was something different this time. The rebellion felt more tangible, more real than ever before. And what of the people? Do they follow him? Cleon hesitated, then nodded. Yes, many have lost faith in the gods. They see the suffering in the streets, the wars, the famines, and they blame you. Hermes' face darkened. They forget that without us, they would not exist. They forget that it was the gods who shaped the world, who gave them life. Perhaps, Cleon said softly, but the mortals are fickle, and they see only what is in front of them. They forget the past, and they question the future. Hermes turned away, his heart heavy with the weight of the oracle's prophecy. The rebellion was no longer just a whisper. It was real, and it was coming. Argos, he murmured, the name dripping from his tongue like a curse. I will find him. Night had fallen over Athens, and the city was quiet, save for the sound of Argos and his followers gathering at the base of the great temple of Zeus. The temple loomed above them, its towering columns reaching toward the sky as if to challenge the very gods themselves. Argos stood at the foot of the stairs, his eyes scanning the faces of his followers. They were men and women, soldiers and farmers, all united by their shared anger and disillusionment. In his hands he held a torch, its flame flickering in the cool night air. This is where it begins, Argos said, his voice low but powerful. Tonight we take the first step in tearing down the old order. The gods have ruled us for too long. It is time we took our fate into our own hands. The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces lit by the glow of the torches they carried. With a nod from Argos, the first stones were thrown. They clattered against the columns of the temple, small at first, but quickly growing into a cascade of rocks and debris as more and more people joined in. The temple shook under the assault, and sound of stone cracking filled the air. As the temple began to crumble, Argos raised his torch high. "Let this be the beginning of a new era," he shouted. "The era of mortals." Suddenly, a figure appeared in the shadows, moving faster than the eye could follow. Hermes, his face tight with anger, stepped into the light, his eyes fixed on Argos. "Stop this madness," he commanded, his voice ringing with divine authority. Argos turned, his eyes narrowing as he faced the god. "Madness," he echoed, his voice full of defiance. "The only madness is the rule of the gods. We no longer need you. We no longer fear you." Hermes' eyes flashed. "You do not know what you are doing, mortal. If you continue down this path, you will bring nothing but ruin." Argos laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "We have lived in ruin for centuries under your rule. It is time for something new." Hermes' face darkened, and the air around him crackled with energy. But before he could act, the oracle's words echoed in his mind. This rebellion was not just about one man's defiance. It was something more, something ancient. And for the first time, Hermes felt a flicker of doubt. The air around the ruined temple of Zeus was thick with tension. The smell of dust and smoke hung in the night as the crumbling remains of the once great temple lay scattered across the ground. Hermes stood at the center of it all, his gaze locked on Argos, who stood defiantly with his torch still burning bright. Around them, the crowd of rebels stirred, murmuring amongst themselves, unsure of how to react to the god standing before them. But Argos did not flinch. He held his ground, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he met Hermes' gaze. The destruction of the temple was not just an act of rebellion. It was a declaration of war. The gods had ruled for too long, and tonight Argos had shown that even Zeus's might was no longer untouchable. "Argos," Hermes said, his voice calm but laced with warning, "you have struck against the gods. This cannot go unanswered." Argos's lips curled into a smirk, and he took a step forward, his voice filled with contempt. "You think we fear you? Look around you, Hermes. The people no longer tremble in your presence. They have seen your weakness. The gods are no longer invincible." Hermes' jaw tightened. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the divine power surging within him, begging to be unleashed. But something held him back. The oracle's words still echoed in his mind. The god's power was waning, and this rebellion was not just a simple act of defiance. It was a sign of something deeper, something far older that was working against them. Behind him, the crowd of mortals watched, their faces alight with a mixture of fear and excitement. They had never seen a god up close before, and yet here stood Hermes, one of the most powerful of the Olympians, seemingly vulnerable. "What you have started here will not end well for you," Hermes said, his eyes narrowing as he took a step toward Argos. "You are playing with forces you cannot possibly understand." Argos raised an eyebrow, his smirk never faltering. "We understand plenty. We understand that for centuries the gods have controlled our fates, deciding who lives and who dies. No more. Tonight we take back our destiny. You do not understand what you are unleashing," Hermes warned, his voice low. "This rebellion will bring nothing but destruction to the mortal world. The gods are not without mercy, but their wrath is not something you can escape." The crowd stirred uneasily at Hermes' words, but Argos remained steadfast, his gaze unwavering. "Let them come," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "We are not afraid." For a long moment, the two stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Hermes could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the enormity of the situation unfolding before his eyes. Argos was not just a man leading a rebellion. He was the spark that could ignite a fire that would burn all of Greece, perhaps even Olympus itself. And then, in a flash of movement, Argos raised his torch high above his head and hurled it toward the remaining rubble of the temple. The flames licked at the crumbled stones, consuming what was left of Zeus's sanctuary. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices filling the night as they watched the fire spread. Hermes' eyes flared with fury, but before he could act, a voice boomed across the sky, cutting through the noise like a thunderclap. "Enough!" The ground shook violently as the sky above Athens darkened, swirling with black clouds that had not been there moments before. Lightning crackled through the heavens, illuminating the city with flashes of blinding light. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air charged with a powerful electric energy. Zeus had arrived. The crowd fell silent, their cheers dying in their throats as they looked up at the churning sky in terror. The fire consuming the temple flickered and died out in an instant, as though snuffed by an invisible hand. In the distance, towering above the city on the peak of Mount Olympus, the silhouette of Zeus stood illuminated by the storm, his form colossal and imposing. His eyes blazed with rage, his hand gripping the lightning bolt that crackled and surged with raw, divine power. "You dare defy the gods?" Zeus's voice roared across the land, shaking the very foundations of Athens. "Mortals, you have forgotten your place." The sky split open as Zeus hurled his lightning bolt toward the city. The crowd scattered, screaming in terror as the bolt struck the ground with a deafening explosion, sending debris flying and shaking the earth beneath their feet. The sheer force of the impact knocked many to the ground, and the air was filled with the acrid smell of burnt stone. Hermes stood his ground, his eyes fixed on Argos, who had not moved, even as the world around him seemed to crumble. The leader of the rebellion remained defiant, his expression unchanged even in the face of Zeus's overwhelming power. Zeus's voice thundered again, this time directed at Hermes. "Destroy them, Hermes. Show them the wrath of Olympus." But Hermes hesitated. His instincts told him to obey, to strike down the mortals who dared to challenge the gods. But another part of him, the part that had listened to the oracle's prophecy, held him back. The gods were no longer as strong as they once were. The rebellion was more than just mortal arrogance. It was a symptom of something larger. Argos stepped forward, his eyes burning with conviction as he raised his voice against the storm. "We will not bow to you, Zeus. You are no longer the gods we once revered. You have become tyrants, lording over us while we suffer." Zeus's rage was palpable. The storm above, growing more violent with every passing second. But before he could strike again, another voice interrupted. "Father, wait." From the shadows of the storm, Athena appeared, her armor gleaming in the flashes of lightning. She descended swiftly from Olympus, her brow furrowed with concern. "Do not strike them down." Zeus's eyes flashed with fury as he turned to face his daughter. "You dare defy me, Athena. These mortals have desecrated my temple, and they will pay for their insolence." But Athena did not back down. She stood tall before her father, her voice steady and calm. "If we strike them down now, we only prove their point. They believe us to be tyrants. If we act in rage, we only fuel their rebellion." Zeus's hand tightened around the hilt of his lightning bolt, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty. "They defy us. They must be punished." "They will be punished," Athena said, stepping closer, her gaze shifting toward Argos, but not with brute force. "But not with brute force. We must be smarter than this. They have lost faith in us, Father. If we wish to maintain our power, we must remind them of who we are." Argos, watching the exchange between father and daughter, stepped forward once more, his voice defiant. "You speak of power, Athena, but your power is fading. The people no longer fear you. They no longer need you. Athena's gaze sharpened. Perhaps you're right, Argos. Perhaps the gods have lost their way, but you underestimate the consequences of your actions. If you continue down this path, you will not just bring ruin to the gods, you will bring ruin to the entire world. Argos's smirk faltered slightly, but he did not back down. We have lived in ruin for centuries. If the world must fall, so be it, but we will no longer live as slaves to your whims. Zeus's grip on his lightning bolt loosened as he considered Athena's words. The storm above began to calm, the thunder fading into the distance, though the clouds still swirled ominously overhead. Hermes, who had been watching in silence, stepped forward. "We can still end this without bloodshed," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Argos, you seek freedom, but do not be blinded by your anger. The gods are not your enemy. If you continue this war, there will be no victors." Argos glanced between Hermes, Athena, and Zeus, his jaw clenched tightly. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the eyes of the crowd watching his every move. For the first time, doubt flickered in his mind. He had expected the gods to strike him down in rage, to show the very tyranny he despised. But this was something else. Athena stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Argos's. "You have lit the spark of rebellion, Argos, but you do not understand the fire you have started. We are not your enemies, but if you continue to defy us, there will be consequences that even you cannot control." For a long moment, Argos stood there in silence, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He had not expected the gods to speak to him, to offer him anything other than death. But now, here they were, offering him a choice, a way out perhaps. Finally, he lowered his gaze, the fire in his eyes dimming slightly. "What would you have me do?" Athena's expression softened, and she extended her hand. "End this rebellion. Return to your people. We will not forget what you have done, but neither will we destroy you." Zeus, though still brimming with anger, nodded begrudgingly, his eyes still aflame with divine fury, but tempered by Athena's wisdom. His lightning bolt remained poised in his hand, though the crackling energy around it had lessened, the storm above continuing to swirl ominously. He stepped forward, his voice a low rumble, skies seeming to tremble in response. "If you stand down, Argos," Zeus said, his voice booming through the air, "I will spare your life and the lives of your followers. But know this, you and your kind are treading on dangerous ground. The gods are not to be mocked." Argos met Zeus's gaze, his jaw clenched, struggling to reconcile his rebellion with the reality of the gods standing before him. He had expected the worst, divine wrath, the end of his life at the hands of an angry god, but here, in this moment, the gods were offering him a path to survival. Could he trust them? Or was this simply another ploy to maintain their grip over mortals? His thoughts swirled as he looked around at his followers. They were watching him, waiting for him to make a choice. Some were terrified, the raw power of Zeus having shaken them to their cores, while others still clung to their defiance, emboldened by the destruction of the temple. But Argos knew, deep down, that continuing this path, continuing to challenge the god's head on, would bring more destruction than he had ever imagined. "You ask me to abandon everything I have fought for?" Argos finally said, his voice low but clear. "You ask me to stop, to submit to you once more, as though we are nothing without your rule. But we are more than that. We are more than your pawns." Athena's eyes softened as she stepped forward, her armor shimmering in the dim light. "I do not ask you to submit, Argos. I ask you to see reason. You have challenged the gods, and you have been heard. But if you push us further, there will be no coming back from the consequences. The world as you know it will fall into chaos." Argos stood still for a moment, the weight of his decision hanging heavily in the air. His hand twitched by his side, his fingers curling into a fist. He had always dreamed of leading this rebellion, of casting down the gods and freeing mortals from their tyranny. And yet, now, standing on the precipice of that dream, he could see the truth in Athena's words. This war would destroy everything. Finally, with a long, slow breath, Argos lowered his head. "I will end the rebellion," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But know this, if the gods continue to rule as they have, this will not be the last uprising. Mortals will not be your slaves forever." A murmur rippled through the crowd of rebels, and slowly, one by one, they began to lower their weapons, their torches extinguished in the dust. The tension in the air began to dissipate, the weight of impending doom lifting as the mortals realized they had been spared. "For now?" Athena gave Argos a long, calculating look. "You are wiser than most mortals, Argos, but do not think that your rebellion will go unpunished. The gods may be merciful, but we are not blind to defiance." Argos met her gaze, his chin lifting slightly. "I expect nothing less." Zeus, still holding his lightning bolt, stepped forward, towering over Argos and the mortals gathered around him. "You are bold, mortal, but remember this, your place is beneath us. Do not forget the mercy you have been granted today." The crowd of mortals shifted uneasily as Zeus spoke, their fear palpable in the air. They had seen the power of the gods, felt the earth tremble beneath their feet, and though their anger had brought them to the brink of rebellion, the sheer magnitude of divine wrath was enough to remind them of their mortality. Zeus, however, did not release the tension entirely. His eyes, cold and calculating, remained fixed on Argos as if waiting for any sign of treachery. "Return to your homes," he commanded, his voice booming across the city, "and let it be known that the god's patience is not infinite." With that, the storm clouds began to recede, slowly dispersing into the night sky. The wind died down, and the eerie silence that followed seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken threat. Zeus stepped back, still watching the mortals, as if expecting them to falter, but they did not. They turned away, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. The rebellion dissolving before it had truly begun. Hermes, watching from the edge of the gathering, felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. The rebellion had been stopped for now, but the seed of discontent had been planted. Mortals were beginning to question their place in the cosmos, and that, more than anything, troubled him. He had seen the look in Argos's eyes, a quiet determination that could not be erased by a single act of divine mercy. As the last of the mortals disappeared into the city, Argos remained standing at the foot of the ruined temple, his eyes fixed on the broken stones. He had led his people to the edge of war, only to be pulled back by the gods themselves. And yet, despite the fear, despite the power of Zeus and the warnings of Athena, he did not feel defeated. He felt resolved. Athena approached him, her face a mask of calm. "You did well to stand down, Argos. But you must understand, this is not a victory. The gods will remember what you have done." Argos glanced at her, his jaw clenched. "I know, but so will the mortals. This is far from over." Athena tilted her head slightly, her gaze thoughtful. Perhaps, but remember, Argos, the gods are not as distant as you believe. We are watching." Without another word, she turned and began her ascent back to Olympus, her figure disappearing into the shadows of the night. Zeus followed her, though his eyes lingered on Argos for a moment longer, a silent reminder of the consequences that still loomed. As the gods departed, the silence of the night seemed to deepen. The city of Athens left in a fragile, uneasy peace. The rebellion had been stopped, but the discontent simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Back on Mount Olympus, the gods gathered in the grand council chamber, their expressions grim. The confrontation in Athens had been averted, but the unease that lingered in the air was palpable. Zeus sat at the head of the council, his hand resting on the arm of his throne, his face dark with frustration. Athena stood by his side, her expression thoughtful but wary, while Apollo and Hermes exchanged quiet glances, each of them grappling with the implications of the rebellion. "We cannot ignore what has happened," Athena said, her voice cutting through the silence. "The mortals have grown bold. They no longer fear us as they once did." Zeus scowled, his fist clenching on the armrest of his throne. "It is insolence. They have forgotten their place. We should have struck them down when we had the chance." "And what would that have achieved?" Athena asked, her gaze steady. "It would have fueled their rebellion further. If we are to maintain order, we must be smarter than this." Hermes, leaning against one of the marble columns, spoke up. "Athena is right. The mortals are no longer the same as they once were. They question us, yes, but they are also growing restless. If we push them too far, we risk losing control altogether." Zeus's eyes flashed with anger. "And what would you have me do? Stand idly by while they tear down our temples?" "No," Athena said firmly, "but we must adapt. The world is changing, Father, and we cannot rule it as we did centuries ago. the mortals no longer worship as they once did. They seek independence, freedom. We must remind them of why they need us, but not through fear alone. Apollo, who had remained silent until now, spoke up, his voice calm but thoughtful. There is truth in what Athena says. The prophecy that the oracle delivered. It warned of more than just rebellion. There is something else at work here, something ancient that is influencing the mortals. If we do not find it, we may face more than just a revolt. Zeus's scowl deepened, his eyes narrowing as he considered Apollo's words. An ancient force. What could be older than us? Apollo met his father's gaze, his expression grave. That is what we must find out. The rebellion is only the beginning. The oracle's vision was not a simple prophecy, it was a warning. Something is coming, and it may be far more dangerous than we realize. For a moment, the council chamber fell silent, the weight of Apollo's words settling over the gods like a heavy fog. Even Zeus, for all his bluster and anger, could feel the truth in what his son had said. The rebellion, the growing unrest among the mortals, it was a symptom of something deeper, something far more ominous. Finally, Zeus rose from his throne, his voice low but filled with determination. Very well, we will find this force, and we will remind the mortals of their place in the order of things. The gods nodded in agreement, their expressions serious as they contemplated the ancient force that might be at play. Even Zeus, known for his quick temper and firm hand, was forced to acknowledge the truth in Apollo's words. The rebellion was not just an isolated act of defiance, but the result of something more sinister, something older and far more dangerous than the gods had faced in a long time. Athena stepped forward, her voice calm yet resolute. We must act quickly. If the mortals have already begun to lose faith, we can assume that whatever force is influencing them will only grow stronger. We need to uncover its origin before it's too late. Zeus's gaze hardened, and he turned toward Hermes, who had been quietly observing the discussion from his place by the columns. Hermes, Zeus commanded, you will return to the mortal realm. I want you to investigate the source of this rebellion further. Find any signs of this ancient force and report back to us. Hermes, ever the dutiful messenger, straightened and nodded. As you wish, Father. I will speak with those closest to the rebellion and search for answers. With a nod from Zeus, Hermes vanished in a blur of speed, already making his way back to the mortal realm. The gods watched him go, their minds turning over the possibilities of what could be stirring such discontent among the mortals. Apollo's voice broke the silence once more, his tone measured and thoughtful. There is another matter we must consider. If this force is as ancient as the oracle suggested, we may need help. The Titans have been imprisoned for millennia, but they are older than even us. Perhaps there is knowledge hidden within their imprisonment that could give us insight. The very mention of the Titans caused a ripple of unease through the council. The Titans, Zeus's ancient enemies, had once ruled the cosmos before being overthrown by the Olympians in the Titanomachy, the great war that had reshaped the world. Since then, the Titans had been imprisoned in the depths of Tartarus, a place where even the gods feared to tread. Zeus's eyes darkened at the suggestion. We swore never to release the Titans. Their power is too great, and their thirst for revenge is still strong. Athena nodded in agreement. It's too dangerous to release them, but Apollo may have a point. If this force predates even us, there may be answers we have not considered. If we are to understand what is influencing the mortals, we may need to consult the very beings who once ruled the universe. Zeus's expression tightened, and for a long moment, the council remained silent as the king of the gods weighed their words. Finally, with a heavy sigh, Zeus relented. Very well, but we will not release them, he said, his voice firm. We will consult with Prometheus. The mention of Prometheus's name brought a murmur of surprise from the other gods. Prometheus, the Titan who had defied Zeus by gifting fire to mortals, had been imprisoned for his betrayal. Chained to a rock, he endured daily torment, as an eagle was sent to devour his liver only for it to regenerate by nightfall. Yet Prometheus had always been different from the other Titans. He was a rebel, yes, but also a seer known for his cunning and foresight. If anyone knows what we are facing, Zeus continued, it will be him. Apollo nodded. Though his gaze was distant, his mind already turning over the implications of speaking with Prometheus. I will go to him, Apollo volunteered. He may be more willing to speak with me than with you. Father. Zeus's mouth twitched at the comment, but he said nothing. Knowing that Apollo was right, Prometheus held no love for Zeus, and the two had been enemies for centuries. But Apollo, with his ties to prophecy and light, might be able to extract the truth from the imprisoned Titan. Go, Zeus commanded, but do not let your guard down. Prometheus is dangerous even in chains. Tartarus was a place unlike any other, a vast, desolate wasteland deep beneath the earth, where time seemed to slow and the very air was thick with the weight of despair. It was here that the Titans had been cast after their defeat, bound and trapped for all eternity, their powers stripped and their influence diminished. Apollo descended into this forsaken realm with cautious steps, the oppressive darkness pressing in on him from all sides. Though he was a god, the weight of Tartarus was tangible even to him. His golden chariot had been left behind, and now, with only the faint light that emanated from his own divine aura, Apollo moved deeper into the abyss. The sound of chains clinking in the distance echoed through the vast emptiness, growing louder as Apollo approached the edge of a towering cliff. And there, at the very bottom of the pit, lay Prometheus, bound to the rock as he had been for centuries. The Titan looked up as Apollo approached, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of defiance and curiosity. His body, though still chained, had healed from the daily torment, and the ever-present eagle that feasted on his flesh was nowhere to be seen for now. Well, well, Prometheus said, his voice hoarse but still laced with wit. To what do I owe the pleasure of a visit from the great Apollo? Apollo stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Prometheus," he began, his tone formal. "I have not come to punish or provoke. I seek your wisdom." Prometheus raised an eyebrow, a slow, sardonic smile spreading across his face. "My wisdom? How interesting. After all this time, Zeus sends his golden son to seek answers from me. The irony is delicious. This is no game. Prometheus," Apollo said sharply, though he kept his tone measured. "The world is changing. The mortals are rebelling, and there is something ancient that is stirring their hearts against us." At this, Prometheus's smile faded, and his eyes sharpened. He shifted slightly against his chains, his gaze fixing on Apollo with sudden intensity. "Ancient, you say? And the mortals rise against the gods?" Apollo nodded, watching the Titan closely. "The oracle has foreseen it, and I believe you know what it is we are facing." For a long moment, Prometheus said nothing, his gaze distant as though he were seeing something far beyond the dark chasm where he was imprisoned. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and laced with a grim understanding. "There is indeed something older than the gods of Olympus," Prometheus said slowly, "something that even you, in all your wisdom, cannot fully comprehend. Long before Zeus and the Olympians took power, before even the Titans ruled, there was a force that shaped the very fabric of existence. It is not a being, not a god. It is something far more primal, and it is waking." Apollo's brow furrowed, his unease growing. What is this force? How can it influence the mortals so strongly? Prometheus's gaze darkened. "It is the very essence of chaos, not like Eris, the goddess of discord, but the raw, uncontrollable chaos that existed before order, before time. When the Olympians overthrew the Titans, they did more than imprison us. They upset the balance of the universe itself. And now, after millennia of rule, that imbalance has festered. The mortals feel it, even if they do not understand it. They crave freedom, they crave change, and chaos is the answer they seek." Apollo's heart sank as he listened. Chaos, true ancient chaos, was a force beyond even the gods' control. It had existed before the Titans, before the world itself had taken shape, and now it was seeping back into the fabric of reality, feeding the rebellion that was rising among mortals. "Can it be stopped?" Apollo asked, his voice betraying the urgency of the question. "Is there a way to restore the balance?" Prometheus's smile returned, though this time it was cold, almost pitying. "Stopped? No, Apollo. Chaos cannot be stopped. It is a force that exists outside of time, outside of fate, but it can be contained if you are willing to pay the price." Apollo's eyes narrowed. "What price?" Prometheus's chains rattled as he shifted slightly, leaning forward as much as his bonds would allow. "To contain chaos, you must sacrifice something of equal power. Something that holds the same weight in the universe, and that will not be easy to find." Apollo's mind raced, trying to make sense of the Titan's cryptic words. But before he could ask another question, Prometheus's eyes glinted with amusement. "You see, Apollo," Prometheus said with a sly smile, "Zeus and the Olympians may be rulers, but they are not the only powers at play in this universe. And as you have just begun to learn, not all forces can be controlled." Back on Olympus, Apollo returned with the weight of Prometheus's revelation heavy on his shoulders. He gathered the gods once more in the council chamber, their faces grave as they listened to what he had learned. "There is a force older than us," Apollo said, his voice steady but filled with foreboding. "It is the essence of chaos itself. It is feeding the rebellion among mortals, and unless we find a way to contain it, it will consume both the mortal world and Olympus." Zeus's face was set in a deep scowl as the weight of Apollo's words sank into the room. The gods of Olympus, rulers of heaven and earth, were no strangers to chaos. Yet what Apollo had brought from Prometheus was no ordinary chaos. It was something primal, older than time, a force that defied even divine control. "What Prometheus has told you," Zeus said, his voice a low growl, "it cannot be true. Chaos cannot return. We created order. We bound the cosmos. We rule." Apollo stood firm, his eyes locked on Zeus. I saw it in Prometheus's eyes. "Father, this is no prophecy to be ignored. The chaos predates our order. It is not a god, not a force we can simply bind with chains or crush beneath thunderbolts. This is something that fuels the very rebellion rising in the mortal world." Athena, her sharp mind always quick to turn over the possibilities, stepped forward. "If chaos is the force behind the rebellion, then we must find the price Prometheus spoke of, something of equal weight to contain it. If we allow it to grow unchecked, it won't just destroy us. It will rip apart the fabric of reality." Zeus's thunderous gaze swept over the gathered gods. He wanted to deny it, to reject this possibility, but deep inside, he knew that the balance had shifted. The rebellion of mortals was more than just defiance. It was a crack in the very foundation of their divine rule. "And what do you suggest, Athena?" Zeus asked, his voice heavy with resignation. Athena's eyes flickered with thought. Prometheus mentioned sacrifice. We must identify something that holds the same power as chaos, something that can maintain the balance, but we do not yet know what that is. At this, Hermes, who had been listening quietly from the edge of the chamber, stepped forward. His usual carefree demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "I will go to the mortal realm again. There is a leader among them, Argos. He may know more than we think. His rebellion is not just about defying us. There is something driving him, something he may not even understand." Zeus narrowed his eyes. "You believe this mortal holds the key?" "Perhaps," Hermes replied. "Argos has become a symbol for the mortals. If chaos is influencing them, it may have already begun to act through him. He could be the connection we need to understand how to stop it." Zeus sat back, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his throne. The silence in the room was palpable, each god feeling the tension between their pride and the growing threat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Zeus spoke. "Go, Hermes. Find Argos, but if he resists, if he defies us again, I will bring my wrath upon him without hesitation." Hermes nodded, his form vanishing in an instant as he descended from Olympus once more. The chamber remained heavy with the tension of what was to come. The gods of Olympus, though powerful, were facing something far greater than mortal defiance. The city of Athens had not yet recovered from the events of the previous night. The destruction of the temple of Zeus was still fresh in the minds of the people, and though the rebellion had been temporarily halted, the tension in the air was undeniable. The streets were quieter, with soldiers patrolling more frequently, their expressions grim. Argos walked through the narrow streets, his mind heavy with the events that had transpired. His rebellion, his bold stand against the gods, had been reduced to a stalemate. The gods had spared him, but the anger and discontent of the mortals remained. The people were still restless, still questioning the gods' rule, but without the clear direction that Argos had once promised them. As he reached the outskirts of the city, where the rebellion's meetings had once taken place, he found Melina waiting for him. Her eyes were sharp, filled with the same fiery determination that had fueled their cause from the beginning. "They're losing faith," Melina said bluntly, her voice hard. "The people don't know what to believe anymore. You stood against the gods and they let you live. Some are saying that you've made a deal with them." Argos's jaw tightened. There was no deal, only a choice: to continue fighting and see the city destroyed, or to find another way. "Another way?" Melina scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "What other way is there, Argos? The gods won't just give up their rule. We have to fight, or we lose everything." Argos felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. The people were looking to him for answers, but he had none. The gods were not as invincible as they once seemed, but their power was still overwhelming. What could mortals do against such beings? Before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air, light and swift. "Argos." Argos turned sharply to see Hermes standing behind him, his figure glowing faintly with divine energy. The messenger god's presence sent a ripple of unease through the air, and Melina's hand instinctively went to the hilt of her dagger. "What do you want?" Argos asked, his voice colder than before. Hermes' expression was unreadable as he approached. "I have come to speak with you, not as a god who seeks to destroy, but as one who seeks answers. The gods know that something is driving this rebellion, something more than just mortal discontent." Argos narrowed his eyes. "You think you can walk among us and demand answers? You may have spared me, but that doesn't mean we've forgotten what the gods have done." "I am not here to demand," Hermes replied, his voice steady. "I am here because I believe you are as much in the dark as we are. There is a force at play, something ancient, older than the gods themselves. It is influencing the rebellion, influencing you, and we need to understand it before it consumes both mortals and gods alike. Argos faltered for a moment, taken aback by Hermes' words. An ancient force? Something older than the gods. It didn't make sense. But then again, none of this had made sense since the rebellion began. And you think I know what this force is? Argos asked, his voice laced with skepticism. I'm just a man who wants freedom for my people. Hermes stepped closer, his eyes searching Argos' face. You are more than that, Argos. You are the spark that lit the fire, but that fire is growing beyond your control. You feel it, don't you? Something is pulling you, pushing you forward even when you don't fully understand why. Argos hesitated. He had felt it, the strange pull, the surge of confidence that had driven him to challenge the gods. But he had assumed it was simply the will of the people, the collective desire for freedom. I don't know what you're talking about, Argos said, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. Hermes sighed softly. You may not know it, but chaos is at work here. A force that existed before the Olympians, before even the Titans. It is ancient and destructive, and it is using your rebellion as a vessel. If you continue down this path, it won't just be the gods who suffer. The entire world will fall into disorder. Melina, who had been listening quietly, spoke up, her voice filled with defiance. And why should we trust you? You're a god, just like the rest of them. How do we know this isn't some trick to stop us? Hermes' gaze shifted to her, his expression calm. Because I am offering you a choice. Help us contain this force, and we will work with you to find a balance between mortals and gods. Continue to defy us, and chaos will consume everything. Not even the gods can stop it alone. Argos' mind raced, torn between his hatred for the gods and the truth in Hermes' words. He had felt the chaos stirring, but he had assumed it was simply the natural course of rebellion. Could it be something more? If I help you, Argos said slowly, what happens to the rebellion? What happens to my people? Hermes' eyes softened. The rebellion doesn't have to end, but it cannot be driven by chaos. If you seek true freedom, we must find a way to restore balance, or else the very world you wish to free will crumble. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Melina looked to Argos, her eyes pleading with him not to trust the gods, but Argos knew he had no choice. The rebellion was spiraling out of control, and if Hermes was telling the truth, chaos would destroy everything they had fought for. Argos clenched his fists, his gaze hardening. I will help you, but only if the gods agree to listen to us. Truly listen. If there is to be peace between mortals and gods, it will not be won. Sighed. Hermes nodded, a flicker of relief passing through his eyes. Very well, I will bring your terms to the council, but know this, Argos. If we fail, both gods and mortals will suffer the consequences. With that, Hermes vanished in a flash of light, leaving Argos and Melina standing in the dimly lit street. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, and Argos could feel the uncertainty growing in his chest. The streets of Athens lay silent after Hermes' departure, but the tension between Argos and Melina was palpable. The rebellion, which had once felt like a righteous path toward freedom, now stood at the crossroads of something far greater, something far more dangerous. The weight of Hermes' words lingered in the air, and Argos could not shake the feeling that this was no longer his battle alone. Melina, her eyes sharp and filled with distrust, paced in front of Argos, her movements quick and agitated. "You've made a mistake, Argos," she snapped, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with fury. "The gods cannot be trusted, especially not now. Hermes is trying to manipulate you, to twist our rebellion into something that serves them." Argos leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, deep in thought. He didn't respond immediately. His mind churned with the implications of the deal he had just made. If chaos was truly behind the rebellion, and if it continued unchecked, everything he and his people had fought for would be reduced to ashes. But siding with the gods, even temporarily, it felt like a betrayal of everything they stood for. "We don't have another choice, Melina," Argos finally said, his voice quieter now, though steady. "This rebellion, the fire we've started, it's being fueled by something we can't control. If chaos consumes the world, then everything we're fighting for is meaningless. Hermes didn't threaten us. He warned us." Melina stopped pacing, her eyes flashing with anger. "So what now? We're just going to trust that the gods will play fair, that they'll suddenly listen to mortals and offer peace? You know that's not how this ends, Argos." Argos sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not saying I trust them. But if we don't stop this chaos, there won't be anything left to fight for. We have to be smarter than this." Melina shook her head, stepping closer to him. "Smarter?" "Smarter would be finding a way to turn this to our advantage. Chaos or no chaos, we can't let the gods dictate how this rebellion ends." Argos's gaze hardened. "This isn't about the gods anymore, Melina. It's about survival. The world is on the edge of collapsing. You and I both know that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Melina's breath came in sharp, angry bursts, but Argos could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She knew the rebellion had spiraled out of their control. She just didn't want to admit it. Finally, Melina sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine. But if this backfires, if the gods betray us, I won't stand down. I'll fight until my last breath." Argos nodded, agreed. Hermes returned to Olympus with a weight on his shoulders that even his divine speed couldn't shake. He stood once again before the gods, their expressions a mixture of impatience, suspicion, and quiet fear. Zeus, seated upon his great throne, was as thunderous as ever, though his eyes held a cold, calculating gleam as he listened to Hermes recount his conversation with Argos. "And so," Hermes finished, "he will help us, but only on the condition that the gods agree to listen to the mortals' demands." Zeus's scowl deepened, his grip on his lightning bolt tightening. Demands. Mortals do not make demands of the gods. They are beneath us. Athena, standing beside her father's throne, tilted her head thoughtfully. Perhaps, Father, we should hear them. If chaos is indeed influencing the mortals, we must be careful not to ignite further rebellion by dismissing their concerns outright. Zeus turned his gaze to his daughter, his eyes flashing with frustration. And what would you suggest? Athena? That we sit on our thrones while mortals question our rule. Athena met his gaze with a calm resolve. No, but there is wisdom in knowing when to adapt. If chaos is driving this rebellion, then the mortals may not even be fully aware of its influence. We must find the balance before everything unravels. Apollo, who had been watching silently from his place in the council, spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of Prometheus's warning. Prometheus said chaos can only be contained by something of equal power. We must find what that is, or this rebellion will only be the beginning. Zeus clenched his jaw, the room falling silent as his mind turned over the possibilities. He knew Apollo's words carry truth, but to listen to mortals, to allow them to believe they had any power over the gods, it went against everything the Olympians had built. And yet, the threat of chaos was real. Zeus could feel it in the air, an ancient, invisible force gnawing at the edges of their rule. Very well, Zeus finally said, his voice low and rumbling like distant thunder. We will listen to their demands, but do not mistake this for mercy. If they falter, if they show any sign of treachery, I will strike them down without hesitation. The other gods nodded, though unease flickered across their faces. They had never before considered the possibility of negotiating with mortals. But this was no ordinary rebellion. As the gods prepared for their next move, Apollo, driven by the cryptic words of Prometheus, made a decision of his own. He had spoken to the council of the need to contain chaos, but Prometheus had been unclear about what the price would be. If chaos was to be stopped, they needed more than words. They needed to understand what exactly they were up against, and for that, Apollo would need to return to the very heart of Tartarus. Descending once again into the dark, suffocating pit, Apollo made his way through the twisting caverns, the oppressive air thick with the weight of ancient power. Unlike his first visit, this time Apollo moved with purpose, his golden aura glowing faintly against the inky blackness of Tartarus. At the bottom of the abyss, chained to his eternal torment, Prometheus looked up as Apollo approached. The eagle, which had been feasting upon his liver, took flight, leaving behind the grisly remains of the Titan's regeneration. Prometheus's eyes, despite the pain and torment, were sharp and gleaming with knowing. Back so soon, Apollo. Prometheus rasped, his voice a low growl. I take it Zeus wasn't satisfied with my answers. Apollo knelt down, his face calm but serious. I need more. Prometheus, you spoke of chaos and the need for balance, but you didn't tell me what that balance is. What must be sacrificed to contain it? Prometheus's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a thin, humorless smile. Ah, yes, the sacrifice. He leaned forward as much as his chains would allow, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Chaos is not something that can be contained with simple force or willpower. It is the primal force of the universe, the very essence of disorder. To balance it, you must give up something of equal importance, something that holds the same weight in the cosmos. "And what is that?" Apollo asked, his voice firm, though the weight of Prometheus's words unsettled him. Prometheus chuckled darkly, the sound echoing eerily in the cavern. The gods themselves. To contain chaos, a god must sacrifice their divine power, not their life, no, but their very essence, their immortality. Chaos is the price for creation, and only something of equal value can bind it. Apollo felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The gravity of the situation was becoming clear. One of the gods would have to give up their immortality to contain chaos. The thought sent a ripple of dread through him, but he knew Prometheus was right. The balance of the universe required something of immense value, and there was no greater value than divine immortality. "One of us," Apollo whispered, the realization settling over him like a heavy weight. Prometheus nodded, his smile fading as he looked Apollo in the eyes. "Yes, Apollo, one of you must choose to fall, to become mortal. Only then can the chaos be stopped, but beware. Once a god sacrifices their immortality, they cannot regain it. The balance will be restored, but at a great cost." Apollo stood, his mind racing. He had to return to Olympus with this knowledge, but he knew the gods would not take it lightly. Zeus, especially, would refuse to believe that any of them should sacrifice their immortality for the sake of mortals. "Thank you, Prometheus," Apollo said, his voice quiet as he turned to leave. "I will tell the others." As he made his way back up from the abyss, Apollo couldn't shake the sense of impending doom that clung to him. The rebellion was not just about mortal defiance anymore. It was about the very fabric of the cosmos. And the only way to stop the chaos was for one of the gods to fall. Apollo stood in the center of the great council chamber of Olympus, the weight of Prometheus's revelation hanging heavily on him. The other gods sat around him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Even the mighty Zeus, usually filled with pride and power, seemed uneasy as he watched his son prepare to speak. "What did you learn?" Zeus repeated, his voice rumbling with impatience. Apollo took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was not news the gods would easily accept, especially not from him. Prometheus revealed the truth about how we can contain the chaos. It requires a sacrifice. A god's immortality must be given up. Only through such a sacrifice can the balance between chaos and order be restored. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Hera, sitting by Zeus's side, gasped in outrage. Athena's brow furrowed deeply, and Poseidon rose from his seat, his trident clattering against the marble floor as his eyes flashed with anger. "Sacrifice our immortality," Poseidon thundered. "You expect one of us to fall? To become mortal? How dare Prometheus suggest such a thing?" Hera's voice was cold as ice. "This is absurd. No god would ever choose to relinquish their divine power. We have ruled for centuries, and no rebellion, no ancient force will change that." Apollo remained calm, though he could feel the tension rising in the chamber. "It is the only way, Mother." Prometheus was clear. Chaos is a force that existed before us, before time itself. If we do not restore balance, it will consume everything. The rebellion is only the beginning. Athena spoke next, her voice thoughtful but grave. "Apollo is right. We cannot underestimate the power of chaos. If what he says is true, then we must consider the cost of ignoring it. But to sacrifice one of us, that is not a decision to be made lightly." Zeus remained silent, his eyes narrowing as he processed Apollo's words. His hand gripped the arm of his throne so tightly that the air crackled with static. The idea of sacrificing a god, of allowing one of their own to fall from Olympus, was unthinkable to him, but deep down he knew there was truth in what Apollo said. Zeus finally spoke, his voice low but filled with controlled fury. "You ask us to give up our immortality for the sake of mortals. For the sake of balance, we are gods. We shape the world. We rule over mortals, not the other way around." Apollo met his father's gaze, his voice unwavering. "And yet, we are at risk of losing everything." "Father, chaos is not something we can control. It is not something that can be bargained with or destroyed. It existed before us, and it will exist long after us if we do not act. We must restore the balance, or we will be undone." The room fell into tense silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Even the more reckless gods like Ares and Dionysus remained quiet, sensing the magnitude of the decision that lay before them. Then, unexpectedly, it was Athena who broke the silence. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it is time for us to consider the possibility that our rule is not eternal. If chaos can rise again, if mortals no longer believe in us, we cannot hold on to our power forever. If a sacrifice must be made, then we must find the one among us who is willing." The chamber stirred at her words. Zeus shot her a sharp glance, but Athena's expression was steady. She knew what she was suggesting was bold, even dangerous, but it was also necessary. If they were to save the world, if they were to protect the balance of the universe, one of them had to fall. Poseidon slammed his trident into the ground, the echo reverberating through the chamber. "I will not be the one to fall," he said, his voice defiant. "My power is the sea itself. Without me, the oceans would descend into chaos." Hera, too, was quick to speak. "Nor will I. Olympus needs its queen." The other gods exchanged uneasy glances, none of them willing to offer themselves up for such a fate. Immortality was their birthright, their identity. To give it up, to become mortal, was to lose everything. Zeus's eyes darkened as he looked across the room, weighing each god in his mind. He knew deep down that none would volunteer, not willingly. And though he despised the very thought of sacrifice, he could see the truth in Apollo's words. Chaos was a force beyond even his control. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Zeus stood from his throne. "No one will be sacrificed," he said, his voice a cold decree. "There will be no fall from Olympus. We are gods, and we will find another way." But as Zeus spoke, Apollo's gaze shifted to someone standing at the edge of the council, a figure who had remained silent throughout the entire debate. It was Hades, the god of the underworld, his dark robes blending into the shadows. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a cold calculation, as if he had already decided on his next move. Hades stepped forward, his voice soft but laced with dark amusement. "And what if there is no other way, brother?" The room fell still as Hades spoke, his presence commanding immediate attention. The god of the dead was not one to speak lightly, and when he did, it was always with a purpose. Zeus's gaze hardened as he turned to face his brother. "You would dare suggest that one of us should fall, Hades, you, of all gods who already rule over death itself." Hades's lips curled into a faint, mirthless smile. "I understand death better than any of you, Zeus. I rule over the dead, and yet I do not fear it as you do. If the price for balance is a god's immortality, then perhaps we should consider what that means for our future." Apollo stepped forward, sensing a shift in the room. "Hades, are you saying you would sacrifice yourself?" Hades's dark eyes glinted with something unreadable. "No, I am not so noble. But there is someone among us who has always lived in the balance between life and death, someone whose very existence is tied to both realms, and if anyone should fall, it should be Persephone." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs of shock. Persephone, the queen of the underworld, had always walked the line between two worlds, spending half her life in the realm of the dead and half in the world of the living. Her connection to both life and death was unique, and Hades had just offered her as the sacrifice to contain chaos. Zeus's expression darkened further, but before he could respond, Hades continued, "Persephone's power comes from both the mortal realm and the underworld. If she sacrifices her immortality, she will restore the balance between life and death, between chaos and order. It is the only logical choice." Apollo's heart sank. He had not expected Hades to offer up Persephone yet. It made sense. Persephone's existence had always been a bridge between worlds, and her sacrifice could very well be the key to restoring balance. But before anyone else could speak, a new voice cut through the tension. No, it was Persephone herself, stepping into the council chamber. Her eyes, usually filled with the warmth of spring, were cold and determined. She had heard everything, and she had already made her decision. "I will not be the one to fall," Persephone said, her voice clear and unwavering. "My life is bound to both worlds, but I will not give up my immortality for this." Hades's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his face, but he remained silent. Persephone stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the gods. "You ask for a sacrifice, but none of you are willing to take the fall. I have already spent half my life in the shadows of death. I will not spend the rest of it as a mortal." Athena, watching her closely, stepped forward. "Then who will take the fall? If not you, then who among us is willing to give up their immortality?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The gods, for all their power, stood on the precipice of a choice they had never before considered. One of them had to fall. One of them had to give up everything they were for the sake of the universe. Apollo, his heart racing, realized that no one would volunteer. No one would willingly step forward and offer themselves up for such a fate. And yet, the choice had to be made. But before he could speak, Hades' gaze turned once more to Zeus, his voice low and dangerous. "Then perhaps it should be you, brother." The room fell deathly silent. Zeus's eyes flared with fury, but Hades continued, his voice unrelenting. "You are the king of the gods, the one who rules over all. If anyone must pay the price, it should be the one who holds the most power. Your fall would restore the balance in ways none of us could. The universe itself would tremble at the loss of the king of Olympus." Zeus's grip on his lightning bolt tightened, and the room buzzed with tension. The idea of Zeus, the all-powerful ruler of Olympus, falling from his throne, becoming mortal, was unthinkable. The tension in the council chamber was palpable, the very air vibrating with the weight of what had just been suggested. Hades had spoken the unthinkable. The idea that Zeus, king of the gods, should be the one to sacrifice his immortality. The room had fallen into a stunned silence, the gods exchanging uneasy glances as Zeus stood rigid, his hand gripping the lightning bolt, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to his throne. Zeus's eyes blazed with fury as he turned to face Hades. "You dare suggest that I, the king of Olympus, should fall? You forget your place, brother." Hades met Zeus's glare with a cold, unwavering gaze. "I forget nothing. I am simply stating what we all know to be true. If the balance is to be restored, it must be through the sacrifice of the one who holds the most power. And that, Zeus, is you?" The other gods remained silent, though unease rippled through the chamber. They had never before seen anyone challenge Zeus in such a way. Even those who had once harbored doubts about their king's decisions now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to respond to Hades' boldness. Athena, ever the strategist, stepped forward. Her face was calm, though her eyes betrayed the intensity of her thoughts. "Hades, you speak of balance, and while there is merit in what you say, we must consider the consequences of such a sacrifice. If Zeus were to fall, it would send ripples through the universe. Chaos might be contained, but the loss of the king of the gods would destabilize the very order we are trying to protect." Zeus glanced at Athena, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes, but before he could respond, Apollo spoke up, his voice measured but firm. "Athena is right. The fall of Zeus would have consequences we cannot fully predict, but that doesn't change the fact that a sacrifice must be made. If it is not Zeus, then who?" The room fell silent again, the gods looking to each other, but no one spoke. The question that had hung over them since Apollo's return from Tartarus loomed larger than ever. Who among them would willingly give up their immortality to restore balance? Zeus, still fuming from Hades' suggestion, finally spoke. No god will fall. I will not allow it. We are eternal, and we will find another way. But even as he spoke, there was a tension in his voice, a subtle hesitation that did not go unnoticed by the others. For the first time in eons, Zeus was faced with a choice that even his immense power could not resolve. He could feel the weight of the cosmos pressing down on him, the ancient force of chaos stirring at the edges of reality. Hera, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Zeus, we must be realistic. Prometheus has spoken, and chaos is not something we can bargain with. If we do not act, we risk losing everything. Zeus's jaw clenched. Hera was his queen, and though their relationship had often been strained, he knew she was right. But how could he, the king of the gods, give up his power? How could he ask any of the others to do so? Hades watched Zeus closely, a faint, knowing smile tugging at his lips. You hesitate, brother. You know the truth as well as I do. The balance must be restored, and it is only fitting that the one who took the throne should be the one to sacrifice it. Zeus's eyes flared, the lightning bolt in his hand crackling with dangerous energy. Enough, he roared, his voice shaking the very foundations of Olympus. I will not fall. I will not sacrifice my power for the sake of mortals. They are nothing without us, and we will not be brought to our knees by their rebellion or by the whims of chaos. Hades remained calm, though his eyes gleamed with dark amusement. Then you are a fool, Zeus. If you do not act, chaos will consume us all, and your throne will mean nothing. Apollo, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward once more. Father, listen to him. I understand your reluctance, but this is not just about power. It's about the survival of the universe. Chaos is already at the gates, and if we do not stop it, we will lose everything. Zeus turned to Apollo, his anger tempered by a flicker of doubt. He could see the sincerity in his son's eyes, the truth of the situation reflected back at him. But to give up his immortality, to relinquish his throne, it was a step Zeus had never imagined taking. Why should I be the one to fall? Zeus asked, his voice softer now, though still filled with the weight of his pride. I am the ruler of the heavens, the king of the gods. Without me, Olympus would fall into disarray. Athena, her voice gentle but firm, stepped forward. Perhaps it is because you are the king. Father, that the sacrifice must be yours. The weight of the universe rests on your shoulders, and if we are to restore balance, it must be through the most significant sacrifice. It is not a sign of weakness to fall. It is a sign of strength. Zeus's gaze flickered between Athena, Apollo, and Hades, each of them representing a different facet of the truth he had been trying to avoid. He could feel the weight of their words pressing down on him, and for the first time in his long reign, Zeus felt truly vulnerable. Before he could speak again, a sudden flash of light filled the chamber, and Hermes appeared, his expression urgent. The rebellion has begun again. Argos and his followers are marching on the temples, and this time they are not alone. Zeus's eyes darkened, his grip on the lightning bolt tightening. Alone? What do you mean? Hermes swallowed, his voice filled with dread. The forces of chaos have begun to manifest. The mortals are not just rebelling, they are being driven by something darker, something far more dangerous than we anticipated. If we do not act now, the mortal world will fall into chaos, and Olympus will be next. Zeus's heart pounded in his chest. The rebellion had resumed, and the force of chaos was no longer lurking in the shadows. It was now a real and present danger. The time for debate was over. Then, we fight, Zeus declared, his voice filled with a renewed determination. We will crush this rebellion once and for all, and we will contain chaos by force. But Apollo stepped forward, his expression grave. Force will not be enough. You know that, Father. We cannot defeat chaos with brute strength. If we go to war now without addressing the true cause, we will only fuel the chaos further. Zeus glared at Apollo, his frustration boiling over. And what do you suggest? That we allow the rebellion to continue? That we wait for chaos to consume us? Apollo shook his head. No, but we must approach this carefully. If we go to war now without making the necessary sacrifice, we risk everything. We must contain chaos first. Only then can we address the rebellion. Zeus's chest heaved with the weight of his decision. His pride screamed at him to crush the rebellion, to assert his dominance as king of the gods. But the truth of Apollo's words gnawed at him. Force alone would not be enough. Hades, his voice calm and measured, spoke once more. Zeus, the time for pride is over. Chaos is here, and it will not stop until we have restored balance. If you wish to save Olympus, if you wish to preserve your throne, you must act now. You must make the sacrifice. The room fell into silence once more as Zeus stood at the crossroads of his decision. The rebellion was escalating, chaos was manifesting, and the fate of the universe rested on the choice he was about to make. Finally, with a heavy sigh, Zeus lowered his lightning bolt, the crackling energy dissipating into the air. His shoulders sagged with the weight of the decision, but his eyes were filled with a grim resolve. Very well, Zeus said, his voice quiet but filled with the finality of his choice. I will make the sacrifice. The room erupted into murmurs of shock and disbelief. Hera stepped forward, her eyes wide with fear. Zeus, no, you cannot. Zeus held up a hand, silencing her. It must be done, Hera. The balance must be restored, or we will all fall. Hades' dark smile returned, though it was tinged with something that almost resembled respect. At last, you understand, brother? Apollo stepped forward, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. You're doing the right thing, Father. Zeus nodded. though his heart was heavy with the weight of his decision. "Prepare the ritual," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We will restore the balance. I will sacrifice my immortality to contain the chaos." As the gods moved to prepare for the ritual, Zeus stood alone in the chamber, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just agreed to. He was the king of Olympus, the ruler of the heavens, and yet, in this moment, he was about to become mortal. The rebellion raged below, and the forces of chaos stirred at the edges of the universe. But Zeus knew that this was the only way. To save Olympus, to save the mortal world, he would give up his power. Zeus stood alone in the grand council chamber, his hand resting on the now silent lightning bolt that had once been the symbol of his power. The weight of his decision bore down on him like a mountain, but there was no turning back now. The gods moved in hushed tones around him, preparing for the ritual that would see their king give up his immortality in the hopes of restoring balance to the universe. Hera, her face pale and stricken, approached Zeus. Her hands trembled as they reached out to touch his arm. "Zeus," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There must be another way. You cannot do this. You are the king of Olympus." Zeus turned to her, his expression softened with regret but firm in his resolve. "There is no other way, Hera. You heard Prometheus. The chaos cannot be contained without a sacrifice of equal weight and my power. My immortality is the price that must be paid." Tears welled in Hera's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had stood by Zeus for centuries through wars, betrayals, and triumphs. To see him now, stripped of the very essence that made him a god, was a fate she could not accept. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "let someone else. Anyone else. Anyone else. You are too important, Zeus. Olympus will fall without you." Zeus placed a hand on her cheek, his thumb brushing away the tear that had finally escaped. "You will be strong, Hera. You will rule in my place. Olympus will not fall, for you will see to it that it stands tall. This is the only way to save everything we have built." Hera closed her eyes, leaning into his touch for what felt like the last time. She wanted to scream, to rage against the fate that had led them to this point, but deep down, she knew Zeus was right. There was no other way. The universe demanded balance, and the king of the gods had chosen to pay the price. Athena approached quietly, her face set in a mask of calm, though her eyes betrayed the sorrow she felt. She had always been her father's favorite, the one he trusted above all others to guide him in matters of wisdom and strategy. But this was a battle even Athena could not win. "The preparations are nearly complete," she said softly. "Once the ritual begins, there will be no turning back. Are you certain you wish to go through with this, Father?" Zeus looked at her, his expression filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Athena, you have always been wise beyond your years, and now I ask you to continue guiding Olympus after I'm gone. You will be the one to ensure that balance is maintained." Athena nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. She wanted to argue, to find some other solution, but like Hera, she knew that this was the only path forward. Zeus was the heart of Olympus, but even the heart had to make sacrifices for the greater good. Apollo, standing beside Hermes and Poseidon, watched in silence as the final preparations were made. His mind was filled with conflicting emotions, relief that they had found a way to stop the chaos, but also sorrow for the loss of his father's immortality. He had seen Zeus as invincible, a force of nature that nothing could touch. To witness him give up everything for the sake of the cosmos was something Apollo had never imagined. Poseidon's face was grim as he stepped forward, his trident tapping against the marble floor. "Brother," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet respect, "I never thought I'd see the day when you would step down, but know this. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. Olympus will stand because of what you're about to do." Zeus met Poseidon's gaze, nodding. There had always been a rivalry between them, but in this moment there was only a shared understanding of what had to be done. The room fell silent as Hades entered, his dark robes trailing behind him like shadows. His expression, as always, was unreadable, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes as he approached Zeus. "You have chosen well, brother," Hades said quietly. "Few would have the strength to make the decision you have made. The balance will be restored, but know this: chaos will always seek to return, even with your sacrifice. The universe will never be truly free of it." Zeus nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "I know. But this is the only way to stop it now. The world will survive, and that is what matters." Hades regarded him for a moment longer, then stepped back, his presence cold but not without a measure of respect. For all their differences, even Hades could not deny the gravity of what Zeus was about to do. As the gods gathered in a circle, the air around them seemed to shift, growing heavy with the weight of ancient power. The sky outside darkened, and the winds howled through the halls of Olympus. The chaos that had been stirring at the edges of the universe now pressed closer, as if sensing that something monumental was about to happen. At the center of the circle, Zeus stood, his eyes closed, as Athena, Apollo, and Hades recited the ancient incantations that would bind the ritual. The words were in a language older than even the gods themselves, a tongue of power and creation that had been spoken at the dawn of the universe. A faint glow began to emanate from Zeus's body, his divine essence shimmering like a second skin. The glow grew brighter, the power of his immortality slowly being drawn from him, coiling into the air like tendrils of light. The other gods watched in awe and sorrow, knowing that this was a moment that would change the course of the universe forever. Zeus's face remained calm, though beads of sweat formed on his brow as the ritual continued. He could feel his power slipping away, the immortality that had defined him for eons being pulled from his very soul. It was not painful, but it was disorienting. Like standing on the edge of a great abyss, knowing that once he stepped forward, there would be no return. Hera stood just outside the circle, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes never leaving Zeus's face. She wanted to reach out to stop the ritual, but she knew it was too late. The incantations were already weaving themselves into the fabric of reality, binding chaos and order together in a delicate balance. The glow around Zeus intensified, and his eyes fluttered open. He looked around at the gods gathered before him. His family, his children, his rivals. And for the first time in centuries, he felt truly mortal. His body was heavy, his senses dulled, and yet there was a strange peace that settled over him. "This is it," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ritual. "This is what it feels like." As the last words of the incantation were spoken, a final surge of energy rippled through the chamber, filling the air with a blinding light. The power of Zeus's immortality, now fully extracted, coalesced into a single point of light that hovered above the circle. It pulsed once, twice, and then shot upward into the sky, vanishing into the heavens as if returning to the cosmos from which it had come. The light faded, and the winds grew still. The ritual was complete. Zeus stumbled slightly, catching himself as he took his first breath as a mortal. The weight of his body felt different, heavier, more fragile. His senses, once sharp and godlike, were now muted, dulled by the limits of mortality. Hera rushed forward, her arms around him, steadying him as he swayed. "Zeus," she whispered, her voice trembling. Are you all right?" Zeus smiled weakly, placing a hand on her arm. "I am mortal," he said softly, the word foreign on his lips. "It feels different, but I am all right." The other gods watched in silence, a mixture of awe and sorrow in their expressions. Their king, the ruler of Olympus, was no longer one of them. He had given up his immortality to save them all, and the weight of that sacrifice hung heavy in the air. Apollo stepped forward, his face somber. "The balance has been restored. Chaos will no longer threaten the universe. For now. But the world is different now, Father. You are different." Zeus nodded slowly, still adjusting to the strange sensation of mortality. "Yes," he said quietly, "but the world will survive, and that is what matters." Athena, her eyes filled with a quiet strength, placed a hand on Zeus's shoulder. "You have done what no other god would do, Father. Your sacrifice will be remembered for eternity." Zeus smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "I hope so, Athena. I hope so." Hades, who had remained silent throughout the final moments of the ritual, finally spoke. "The rebellion in the mortal realm is not yet over. Argos and his followers still march on the temples. They will not stop simply because the balance has been restored." Zeus straightened, his eyes flashing with determination. "Then I will go to them." The gods exchanged surprised glances. "You? Apollo asked, frowning. But you are mortal now. You cannot face them as you once did. Zeus stood tall, his eyes flashing with the fire of his old resolve, though his body now carried the weight of mortality. The gods around him were filled with a mixture of awe, concern, and uncertainty. He had given up everything, his immortality, his throne, to restore balance to the universe, but now he faced a new challenge. The rebellion of mortals still raged, and without his godly power, Zeus would confront them not as a ruler of Olympus, but as a mere man. Apollo stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. Father, you cannot face them alone. You are mortal now. The power that once commanded the heavens is no longer yours. Argos and his followers are armed and driven by the chaos that has only just been contained. Zeus turned to Apollo, his expression calm but resolute. I may no longer be a god, but I am still their king. If there is to be peace between mortals and gods, it will begin with me. I will speak to Argos. I will show them that the gods are not their enemies. Athena, ever the voice of reason, placed a hand on Zeus's shoulder. Father, we can accompany you. Even without your immortality, you need not face them alone. We can stand with you, as we have always done. Zeus shook his head, his gaze steady. No, Athena, this is something I must do alone. If I bring the gods with me, it will only further the divide between us and the mortals. They must see that I am willing to stand before them as one of them, not as their ruler, but as their equal. The other gods fell silent, knowing that once Zeus made up his mind, there was no changing it. Hera stood close by, her hands still trembling as she adjusted to the reality of her husband's new mortal form. Her voice, soft but filled with love, broke the silence. Then let me come with you, Zeus, she said, her eyes pleading. I have stood by your side for centuries. Let me do so now, even in this new world. Zeus smiled gently and placed his hand over hers. No, Hera, you must stay here and protect Olympus. The gods will need you now more than ever, and you are the one who can ensure that peace is maintained. You are stronger than you know. Tears welled in Hera's eyes, but she nodded, knowing that he was right. She stepped back, her heart heavy, as she watched him prepare to leave. Hades, who had remained quiet since the ritual, stepped forward, his dark robes flowing like shadows. You walk a dangerous path, brother, he said in a low voice. Mortals do not forgive easily. They will see you as the embodiment of everything they fought against. Be careful. Zeus met Hades' gaze, nodding in acknowledgement. I know, but I believe in their capacity for reason. They have been driven by chaos, but now that balance is restored, I will show them the truth. With that, Zeus turned toward the steps of Olympus, his form still towering and regal despite his newfound mortality. The wind whipped through his hair, and for a moment, the gods watching him felt the weight of something monumental shifting, as if this was the beginning of a new era. Zeus made his way down the steps of Olympus, the sacred path that connected the heavens to the world of mortals. For the first time in his eternal life, the journey felt different. The air was cooler, the wind harsher against his skin. The earth beneath his feet felt solid, heavy, reminding him with each step of the mortality he now carried. As he neared Athens, the sounds of unrest grew louder. The rebellion was in full force, with the cries of angry mortals echoing through the streets. The temple of Zeus, now partially destroyed, loomed in the distance. Argos and his followers had gathered there, their torches flickering against the twilight sky as they prepared for the final assault against the last symbol of the god's power in the city. Zeus's heart tightened at the sight. These were the people he had watched over for centuries, the people whose lives he had shaped with every thunderbolt, every act of divine intervention. And now they stood ready to tear down the last remnants of their belief in the gods. As he approached the temple, he spotted Argos at the front of the crowd, his face lit by the glow of the fires. The once charismatic leader of the rebellion looked more intense, more desperate now. Chaos had driven him to the brink, and even with the balance restored, the fury that had been unleashed still burned in his eyes. Zeus took a deep breath and stepped forward, walking into the light of the flames. The crowd fell silent as they recognized him. Whispers spread like wildfire through the ranks of the rebels. They knew this man. He had been their god, their king. But now, there was something different about him, something mortal. Argos turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw Zeus approaching. "So, the great Zeus finally comes down from Olympus," Argos called out, his voice filled with venom. "What brings you here? Have you come to beg for mercy?" Zeus stood tall, his gaze meeting Argos's. "I have come to talk." Argos, no more gods, no more divine power, just man to man. The crowd murmured, unsure of what to make of this declaration. Argos sneered, stepping closer to Zeus. "Talk. You think words can fix what the gods have done to us? For centuries, you have ruled over us, dictating our lives, deciding who lives and who dies. And now, you think you can stand before us as one of us?" Zeus nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, I stand before you as a mortal, just as you are. I have given up my immortality. The chaos that drove you to this rebellion has been contained, but that does not erase the pain you feel. I know you believe the gods have wronged you, and perhaps you are right. But this destruction, it will not bring you the peace you seek." Argos's face twisted in anger. "Peace. We don't want peace. We want justice. The gods have ruled us for too long, and we will not stop until they are no more." Zeus took another step forward, his gaze unwavering. "And what will you do once the gods are gone? Argos, who will protect the world from the forces that seek to destroy it? Chaos has already touched this world, and if the gods fall, it will rise again, stronger than before. Without balance, the world will collapse into disorder." Argos hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. The crowd behind him shifted, their anger wavering as they listened to Zeus's words. For all their fury, the people could not deny the truth that lay in what he said. Zeus continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of wisdom. I have made mistakes, Argos. The gods have made mistakes. But this is not the way to fix them. Mortals and gods can live together, but only if we find a way to listen to one another. I am no longer your king. I am one of you. But I ask you, as a man, to end this rebellion. Let us rebuild together. The crowd fell silent, their torches dimming as the weight of Zeus's words settled over them. Argos stood frozen, his fists clenched as he struggled with the truth of what he was hearing. The anger that had driven him for so long wavered, and for the first time doubt crept into his mind. But the gods, Argos said quietly, his voice filled with confusion. They have taken so much from us, and they have given much as well, Zeus replied gently. But now the choice is yours. Will you continue to fight, to destroy until there is nothing left? Or will you help build a world where mortals and gods can coexist in peace? Argos looked around at his followers, seeing the uncertainty in their eyes. The fires of rebellion that had burned so brightly now seemed dim, their anger replaced by doubt. Finally, after a long moment, Argos dropped his weapon to the ground. The sound echoed through the silent crowd. I don't know anymore, Argos admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But I can't do this. Not like this. Zeus stepped forward, placing a hand on Argos's shoulder. That is the first step, Argos. The first step toward healing. One by one, the rebels began to lower their weapons, their anger dissolving as they realized that the fight was over. The rebellion had come to an end, not with violence, but with words that only a mortal king could speak. As the fires were extinguished and the people began to disperse, Zeus stood among them, his heart heavy but filled with hope. He had given up everything, his immortality, his throne, for this moment, and though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew that this was the beginning of a new era. Athens, the city that had once been on the brink of destruction, now had a chance to rebuild. The gods would no longer rule with unchecked power, but neither would they abandon the world. There would be balance, and with it, peace. As the night deepened, Zeus looked up at the sky, the stars shining brightly above him. He was no longer one of them, no longer a god. The night sky over Athens sparkled with countless stars, their light faint but steady, as though the heavens themselves were watching the final moments of a story that had been eons in the making. Zeus, now fully mortal, stood among the people he had once ruled over, his heart both heavy and light. The rebellion had ended, not through force or divine intervention, but through the power of understanding and reconciliation. And though the future remained uncertain, the dawn of a new age had begun. The crowd, once filled with angry rebels, slowly dispersed, their weapons abandoned and their fires extinguished. Argos, The man who had led them to the brink of war stood beside Zeus, his face pale and uncertain. The weight of his actions still hung over him, but for the first time, there was a sense of relief, of hope. Argos glanced at Zeus, his voice low and filled with guilt. "I never thought it would end this way. I thought we had to fight." Zeus placed a hand on Argos's shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "Fighting is not always the answer. Sometimes the greatest victory comes from knowing when to stop. You did what you thought was right, Argos. But now you have the chance to build something better." Argos looked around at the remnants of the rebellion, his followers now slowly returning to their homes. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Zeus smiled faintly, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Now, the mortals and the gods must find a way to coexist. The balance has been restored, but that doesn't mean our journey is over. It will take time, and it will take patience, but I believe in the strength of both mortals and gods to find peace." Argos nodded, though he still seemed troubled. "And you? What will you do?" "Zeus, you're mortal now. What place do you have in this new world?" Zeus looked up at the night sky, the stars gleaming like distant memories. "I will live among the mortals as one of them. I will help rebuild, just as you will. But my time as king of the gods is over. I am no longer Zeus of Olympus. I am simply Zeus, a man." The weight of those words hung in the air, and for a moment Argos could only stare at the man who had once been the most powerful being in the universe. The realization of Zeus's sacrifice struck him fully, and he found himself filled with a deep sense of respect for the former god. "Then we will build this new world together," Argos said quietly, "and we will make it better than it was before." Meanwhile, high atop Mount Olympus, the gods gathered in their grand halls, watching from a distance as the rebellion below finally came to an end. The winds that had once howled with the threat of chaos were now still, and the tension that had gripped the heavens had eased, though it had left its mark. Hera stood at the edge of the great marble balcony, her eyes fixed on the distant city of Athens. She had watched Zeus's journey into the mortal realm, her heart filled with pride and sorrow in equal measure. She had always known that her husband was a great leader, but to see him give up his immortality for the sake of balance had shown her a side of him she had never fully understood. Athena approached quietly, standing beside her mother. "He did what needed to be done," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Zeus has ensured that both mortals and gods will have a chance to rebuild." Hera nodded, though her expression remained distant. "He gave up everything," she whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. "He gave up his immortality, his power, his throne." Athena's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. It was not just for the mortals. It was for all of us. Chaos would have consumed everything if not for his sacrifice. Now, we must ensure that peace is maintained. Hera turned to look at her daughter, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and pride. And what of Olympus? Athena? What will become of us now that Zeus is no longer our king? Athena smiled faintly. Zeus may no longer sit on the throne, but his legacy will live on. The gods will continue to rule, but we must do so with wisdom, with understanding. We cannot return to the way things were. The world has changed, and we must change with it. Hera took a deep breath, her gaze softening. She knew Athena was right. The time of the old order was over. The gods would still have a place in the world, but they could no longer rule through fear or dominance. They had to earn the respect and trust of the mortals once more. Back in the mortal realm, Zeus settled into his new life as a mortal. The people of Athens, who had once seen him as an untouchable god, now looked to him as a wise and humble man. He became a figure of peace and guidance, helping to rebuild the city that had been scarred by rebellion. His presence brought calm to those who had once been consumed by anger and chaos, and his wisdom, now unburdened by divine arrogance, became a beacon of hope for all who sought a better future. Argos remained by Zeus's side, working with him to mend the rifts between the mortals and the gods. The temples that had once been targets of destruction were now places of reflection and learning, where mortals could come to understand the gods and their role in the world. The relationship between gods and mortals had changed forever, but it was no longer defined by fear or dominance. It was a partnership, one built on mutual respect. Zeus lived many more years in the mortal realm, but his body, once immortal and indomitable, began to feel the effects of time. His hair grew silver, his hands became weathered, and his strength slowly faded. Yet he embraced his mortality with grace, knowing that this was the natural order of things. On a quiet evening, as the sun set over the city he had once ruled, Zeus sat on a hill overlooking Athens. Argos joined him, sitting beside the man who had once been a god but was now his friend. "The city is at peace," Argos said, his voice soft. Zeus smiled faintly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Not thanks to me, Argos. Thanks to all of us. The peace we have built was not the work of one man or one god. It was the work of many." Argos nodded, though he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. Zeus had given so much, and now, as the years wore on, it was clear that his time was drawing to a close. Zeus leaned back against the grass, his eyes closing as he took a deep breath. "The world will go on, Argos. Mortals and gods will face new challenges, new trials, but the balance has been restored. That is what matters." Argos looked at Zeus, his heart heavy with emotion. "And what of you, Zeus? What will become of you?" Zeus's smile deepened, though his eyes remained closed. "I will rest. And when my time comes, I will pass into the next world, as all mortals do. I have lived a long life, both as a god and a man, and now I am ready to embrace whatever comes next." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Zeus's breathing slowed and his body became still. Argos sat beside him, watching as the former king of the gods slipped peacefully into the embrace of death. The weight of his sacrifice finally lifted. Zeus was laid to rest in the city he had once ruled, his grave marked not by grand statues or towering monuments, but by a simple stone that bore his name. The people of Athens, and indeed the world, remembered him not as a distant and fearsome god, but as a man who had given everything to save them. The gods of Olympus, now led by Athena and Hera, ruled with wisdom and compassion. They watched over the mortal world, guiding it with a gentle hand, ensuring that the balance between chaos and order was maintained. Mortals, in turn, honored the gods not with fear, but with respect and gratitude. Zeus's sacrifice became a story, told for generations, a reminder that true power did not come from dominance or immortality, but from the willingness to give everything for the sake of others. His legacy, both as a god and as a mortal, would never be forgotten. And so, the world moved forward, the dawn of a new age, ushered in by the mortal king who had once ruled the heavens. The end